Eleanor, thank you so much for joining the Hurt Healing podcast today.
Pleasure to be here.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Me too.
You've written a fantastic novel, In Judgment of Others, which delves into mental health within Britain's rural elite. So why do you think that there's so much stigma surrounding mental health within Britain's ruling elite?
Well, I think it's certain types of mental health, which is what the book really talks about. And the type that's most presenting in the book, our lead character, Tessa, and it's no giveaway to say that within the very first chapter, she has a psychotic episode. Her mental health crisis, she's diagnosed bipolar. And the way that that presents, she floods the house, she tears the place up. It's very, I think, unpalatable to that sense of selling the perfect kitchen, the perfect children, the perfect car, and so on. Which, I mean, it exists everywhere. It's not just rural England where it grows large. But I really picked that bit of that sector of society because it was such a ready-made play, and there is a play within the book, Blithe Spirit. Because it is somewhere that I think people aspire to be, Middle England. The town is Midhurst. I don't know if you know it, but it's very, it's got it all. It's got polo, it's got the Cowdray estate, it's got the farm shop where everything is just dirty enough, but not too dirty. And, I sort of worry now that I'm promoting the book that the people of Midhurst will never speak to me again, because there are amazing people in Midhurst, and individually, people talk about their mental health and will be quite open about it, but there's a sort of collective feeling that keeps up this lie around not running down the street with your knickers on your head, which is not what Tessa does, but in effect, that's what she does. Her way of expressing her crisis is through a kind of unpalatable show of distress. And it just doesn't suit the perfect that is sold by that kind of life, Argos and wellies and Labradors and shooting and hunting and all of that. So, I picked it because of that. And I think that it's rife there because there is this sense that you'll move to the country, you'll have a certain amount of money and everything will be beautiful and fine. And of course it isn't. And I think psychosis within the middle classes is something which it's harder to express. And I think there's a snobbery around it. I think, psychosis amongst those who are not of the middle classes, there's a sort of snobbery around expecting it, which is deeply unfair. And I think among the aristocracy, who I know very well, there's a kind of closed door, buy your way out of it. But I think with the rural England middle classes, and this includes the farming community as well, there's just a sense of keeping a lid on it, and it really doesn't serve Tessa, and as we'll find out, it doesn't serve the other characters in the book either.
Absolutely. I mean, in your experience, do you think certain mental illnesses are more stigmatized than others within the rural elite? So, for example, talking about bipolar and, for example, narcissism.
Absolutely. And really that's what the book hones in on. And that's the question I'm constantly asking. It's not that when you're up close with psychosis, and there's a point in the book when one of the characters says, it's not just a slight panic attack at the deli counter. This is the real thing. This is psychosis. And with some forms of psychosis, that, like with bipolar, they do get treated, for better or worse, pretty well. There's a system, and, you will probably get sectioned for your own safety and the safety of those around you. And that's okay. And that's not what I'm having a go at or really asking to be looked at. It's why we don't treat, for instance, narcissism in exactly the same way. Why aren't narcissists sectioned? And the book is about how the narcissistic amongst us, and that's the clinically narcissistic, cause as much damage as those with bipolar, but they're not treated the same. In fact, they're elevated and are left to cause this enormous amount of damage. And I think a lot of that has to do with the characteristics of narcissism. And I'm pretty sure everybody listening to this knows somebody who's clinically narcissistic. And it's very much appeals to the kind of, limbic brain belonging sense that we have. You get real close to the big, loudest voice, even if they are figuratively wielding a knife. You will do that because that's for your sense of safety. Whereas somebody who is flooding the house and throwing their phone down the well and crashing their car into a lamppost, you'll definitely lock them up. But actually the damage, I can speak of my own life, the damage that has been caused me by clinical narcissists is way more than those with diagnosed with bipolar, and I know plenty of both. And that's the question the book asks.
Yeah, and I think we want to highlight that it is clinically diagnosed narcissism, because I think in this day and age, narcissism is this term that's thrown around in a very nonchalant way.
Right.
And actually being a clinically diagnosed narcissist versus someone accusing someone of being a narcissist is they're two very, very different things.
Very, very different things. And I'm really glad you point that out, because, it's thrown around exactly as a bit on the spectrum is thrown around, or, I'm a bit manic is thrown around. And one of the characters points out clearly we are talking about psychosis. And in that, clinical narcissists are acting out their magical thinking and their fantasies absolutely in broad daylight and causing absolute havoc. But it's just because it doesn't look like it. It doesn't look like an obvious psychotic episode. It just at best goes unnoticed, and at worst is absolutely celebrated. I mean, look what's happened in America. It's an absolutely perfect example of what this book's about.
And I think that's what clinically diagnosed narcissists are very, very good at. They become very devious, and they're very sly with their behaviors because they know exactly how to play the game. And I think what you've actually touched upon, which is so interesting, is that often people who are very vulnerable with another mental disorder, whether it be bipolar, whether it be OCD or anorexia, they often look to narcissists for that source of safety and support, and often they're the product of narcissists. I mean, I've spoken now, I think, to enough people to be able to say that it's a very common occurrence that children of clinically diagnosed narcissists do develop mental health conditions, and this is where a huge problem arises.
Absolutely. And I think because it is crazy making. It's crazy making to be in the company of somebody who is, they're riding about 15 horses at once, and you lose your sense of reality. And certainly Tessa and the friend from whom that character was born, they are a product of that, of just not knowing what is reality and trying to find that place. And in my experience, certainly with a couple of friends, their bipolar diagnosis was absolutely born of being brought up by a narcissist, a clinical narcissist who, and that's the other really difficult thing about narcissism, clinical narcissism, is that with every other mental health condition that I've ever been up close with, that person at some point in the circle of their experience will self-identify. They'll know. They may not know for the whole circle, but there's always a moment when they have a kind of, okay, I can see there's a problem here. I've never known a narcissist self-diagnose, because that is literally part of the condition. That there is zero self-reflection, and it makes them the most dangerous people on the planet, or it makes it the most dangerous condition on the planet by far. And I think I reached a point witnessing a very good friend of mine and various other people over 30 years really being vilified for their condition and watching other people get away with theirs absolutely scot-free. And the book was born out of rage, really.
So what did you experience in firsthand which inspired you to write the book?
Well, I dedicate the book to my impossible friend, and they will remain anonymous, obviously. But I experienced their trajectory from the age of, I met them when they were 19. They're now in their 50s. And their first psychotic episode was when they were 21 years old. They didn't turn up to their 21st birthday party. We all did, but they were sectioned then. So I've spent 30 years standing beside my friend, watching them be really punished for their condition. And which is not to say that there aren't things they could do to manage it, which would make things better. But ultimately, there's a punishment around it. And in my own experience, I mean, this is tricky because I absolutely can't name any names, but I can say in my own life, there have been people close to me whose version of how reality is and who were of a great influence on me. It was only later in life that it dawned on me that not only did they not know what they were talking about, but they had a kind of psychotic agenda, which means, they were unconscious of it. But nevertheless, it suited them to have me and various other people in certain positions in their life. And the story they were telling was not the real story at all. And when that realization hit me, and it didn't hit me that long ago, I'm a survivor, and I only understood that about 4 years ago when the sort of box opened in my head. And when that happened, so many other truths were kind of realized by me around all of the things that I'd been told as to what reality was and what I was living. And it was like this crazy puzzle suddenly fell into place. And I understood that many of the things that I'd been told by people who were of great influence on me simply weren't true. Now, I knew they weren't lying. I understood that they were protecting themselves by creating a reality that they took me hostage in. And that, again, I think anyone who's been up close with a narcissist knows that being taken hostage is quite a standard phrase. And it simply means that you're being pulled into their reality so that they can sustain their reality. But actually, it's not true. So I pulled on a lot of that. And I pulled on a lot of witnessing my friends' experience through it. And I often make this analogy as well when I've been talking about the book. Between cancer and HIV, it's the same kind of bias is shown when someone is diagnosed with a cancer. Obviously, everyone is deeply compassionate and loving towards that person. And when somebody is diagnosed with HIV, people are not. Sometimes they are, but it's not a guaranteed 100%. There's a shame attached, there's a blame attached, there's victim blaming in there. There's all kinds of societal biases, which, perhaps born of the whole sort of system that came to be in the 90s around it. Nevertheless, it presides. And I witnessed the same around bipolar. I've never known somebody but diagnosed with bipolar who hasn't had it be born of trauma. And yet when they speak out their traumas, I think they're often, I've witnessed them not being listened to. It's one of the things I always do with my friend when she's in a psychotic episode. I let her speak and I let her feel believed. Because even if she's telling me, and I'm making inverted commas things with my fingers now, even if she's telling me something which is seemingly crazy, off the bat, absolutely impossible, the fact is she's speaking of trauma somewhere in there. And that little girl inside of her is just trying to express themselves. And I talk a lot about the inside matching the outside in the book, and a lot about the poles, which is obviously bipolar. Anyone who's up close to it knows that people who have bipolar, what they're doing is they're going from one pole to another because the middle ground, which is where we all grow up as children, was unsafe. So you have to be at one end or the other. So letting her speak and be believed is something I do all the time. I've just been on the phone to another friend who's literally in a process right now. And when they talk about it, I know they're talking about something that happened to them 50 years ago. And they put it on today, but I know that's not true. So I just let them speak,
I think feeling safe and feeling heard are the two. I mean, when parents come to me and they say, I've got a daughter and she's really, really struggling with a mental health condition. Like, what can I do as a parent? And all I say is just listening and making them feel seen and making them feel safe and loved.
Absolutely.
And I think this is where a lot of, as you say, a lot of the trauma stems from. And I think this is the problem when by the time the mental health condition is often diagnosed, it's too late. And so what can one then do to remedy actually the damage that might have been done by a clinically diagnosed narcissistic parent who's often there still in the picture? And I think that's something that society really needs to focus on is, can narcissists heal? What do you think about that?
I mean, that's a real tricky one. My friend Sarah Fay has written a great book. Her first book is called Pathologized, and the second one is called Cured. And she posits that you can cure. And it's a really brave word to use, I think, because cured, there's an implicit meaning in cured, which is a sense of agency and management and responsibility of your condition. And now I know people with various, again, bipolar, who would say that, it's a chemical imbalance. There's nothing can be done. In effect, it's nothing to do with them. And I fully understand that as an understanding of their condition. But I also witness that, there's a whole conversation to be had about diagnoses, isn't there, anyway, as well, which I don't get into in the book. But I think there's a whole piece about management, and there's a whole piece about understanding where it came from. And for instance, I would say about my friend on whom the book is based, that they have complex PTSD, and that bipolar is a sort of final bit of that. And although there's now a broken lever in their head through habitual extreme versions of their trauma coming out in either direction, there's an enormous amount that could be done, that they could do. And that, if every single traumatized person in this country had another person solely dedicated to listening, helping them feel seen, tracing it back to their original trauma, the healing that could be achieved is absolutely off the scale. But, of course, that's a crazy notion. There aren't literally enough bodies in the world or resources to do that. But I think, and I know I've got complex PTSD, and, I know there's an enormous amount that one can do, given the resource which I'm lucky enough to have, to cure. It's a dodgy word, isn't it, cure? But I'm quite interested in using it because, if we can just get past, if we can understand the difference between blame and responsibility and get past that and have a look at the agency around it and take it back to trauma, I think there's a lot that can be done there. But I think as well, I've witnessed parents, and certainly, I've witnessed parents, of course they love their child who's struggling, but there's a certain amount, and this is going to sound real dodgy, but there's a certain amount which suits the family dynamic to have that child remain in that position. And that child, or that grown person with the injured child inside, sometimes they have to make a choice to just get away from that whole family system if they want to make any headway.
Yeah, well, it's part of the dysfunctional family triangle, isn't it? And it's very discombobulating for everyone suddenly if someone gets better.
Ceases to play that role.
Exactly, because everyone's role then changes. And that can be incredibly unsettling for a marriage. It can be very unsettling for a sibling who's hidden behind another sibling's mental health issue. And suddenly, two parents who may be solely focused on getting this child better, well, what have they got to focus on after?
Well, and certainly perhaps they don't want to focus on the state they were in when, and so on and so on. And again, these conversations, we have to be so tender around them, because blame and responsibility are such bedfellows. And it doesn't help anyone to say, oh, well, you're saying it's my fault then. Because nobody's saying that, but we are saying, at least I am saying, and I get the impression that you're saying, that just taking a breath and having a look at responsibility. And it's hard, I'm a mother, and I've read Internal Family Systems and all the Gabor Mate, and it's very hard to read those books and not think, shit, man, what have I I've done something terrible, whatever it is. But if we're going to make headway, sitting down at the table and grabbing those bits. I've done it with my children. There've been things going on between them that have been intergenerational. And I don't want those things to go on into adulthood. And I've had to grab that bit by the neck and stick it on the table and shine the light on it and say, come on, let's look at it. Let's take the personal out and see how it's destroying all of us. But it's an enormous piece of work. As you say, that one ill person, it's not just one person. They are expressing a family dynamic 9 times out of 10.
I remember actually when we were doing some family work, and a doctor said, anorexia isn't an illness which is inflicted on one person, it's a family illness.
Absolutely.
And that's the case with any mental health issue.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm very interested in this concept of blame versus responsibility, because I do think, particularly within the group, you identify the rural elite and in the UK, there's a lot of blame that tends to be directed at people who are suffering with mental health issues. And I've experienced that firsthand. It's very much like, you can get better. You need more determination. You've got the tools, now get on with it. And it's a very accusatory approach. And I think it's particularly from the sort of war generation, that Victorian mindset of stiff upper lip, you just push on and get on with it. And when you've had a certain amount of resources thrown at you and you've been lucky enough to experience therapy, and there's this expectation you should be better by now.
Right. And also I think that there's a fixed mentality. I think people, when somebody expresses some sort of suffering, there's a mentality that I've come across a million times, and I really endeavour to never do it, to feel like, okay, I've got to somehow fix you, and you're getting better is now going to make me feel better, and you not getting better is almost that I'll take that personally. And of course, actually, if you've had the courage to share with me that whatever's going on with you, the last thing you need is me to get cross with you that you're now not getting better according to the rhythm that I think you should. But I see it comes from this like wanting to fix, must fix. I just did a podcast yesterday or a couple of days ago. It's called Unfixed, and it's run by a woman who has a long-term condition, and she really wants to lean into this idea of not fixing. Let's just put that right aside and do the listening instead. So yeah, I'm sorry you've experienced that. I'm not at all surprised to hear you have. There's a stiff upper lip, and there's my inability to fix you is pissing me off. So now you're pissing me off.
And I think that's the problem, because particularly as a child, now I'm not a child, so I do have to take responsibility for it myself. But there is definitely still this mindset of, you need to be fixed to operate functionally in a society. There's not this trajectory of healing is ongoing. It's not about peeling one layer of the onion off at a time, which is actually what I'm learning recovery looks like. As you said, are we curable? Is anyone curable? Is a human curable? We all have our facets and we all have our quirks. But I think the journey of healing is incredibly slow. And I think particularly for those clinically diagnosed narcissists, who I see as being the ones that definitely they want to fix, they parachute in a crisis. And if it's not going according to their timeline, they get fed up and they zoom out, or they want all the glory when the problem is fixed and then they leave. And that's definitely something that I've experienced firsthand time and time again. And I find that extraordinary, but it is something that we need to raise awareness of, because I do think that it's so debilitating for that inner child and that voice that is slowly emerging to then just be shot down again. It's slowly emerging. And as you say, it is incrementally slow, this journey.
And you can spot a narcissist a mile away because of the speed, the rate at which they operate. It's fast. And it's a whirlwind of panic, chaos. Then they can be the hero and not exactly. Whereas actually it's incredibly slow. And I think, and so it should be. I always think of it like the Grand Canyon, the tiny little brush, and it's just a little bit. I've been working with a somatic experiencing practitioner since the middle of COVID, and we just, it's the tiniest piece every now and again, but then it really sticks. And I think the other reason why society, rural elites and narcissists, want it done quick is because the reflection of illness is just so unpalatable in terms of what it says about the family and the society in which they live. They just do not want to look.
I think that's a very, very interesting point, because again, it speaks more of the state of the family having an ill child or someone who's ill within the family, or for a husband who's got an ill wife. It sort of speaks of the dysfunction that they're overtly conveying to everyone else. And in fact, as you so rightly say, and this is what I've discovered, is that, and that's why I think actually these treatment centres are often not the best option for so many people, because they want to come in, fix, whereas actually recovery is such a slow journey. And it's just chipping away very, very incrementally. And those are the changes that last, because the times when I've had everything stripped away and it's gone 100 to 0, well, of course, what happens? You come out of a facility and you come out of the container, which is real life, and you can bounce straight back even to 120 sometimes.
Yeah. It's tough. I've been in and out visiting friends. I've never been sectioned. I don't have a diagnosis of a mental health diagnosis apart from complex PTSD. It's just a condition. But I've been in to visit friends many, many times. And, on the one hand, I think I would say this about the whole of the NHS. I go in and I see people doing an extraordinary job with limited resources. I don't know what the answer is. And certainly I've seen friends who, for their own safety, have needed to be taken somewhere because they are going to kill someone themselves. But as you say, they're in for 6 weeks, 2 months, depending on beds, and then given the drugs that are thought to be the right ones and come out. And, I've seen my friend, they're now in the low bit where they cannot get out of bed. And I hesitate to say the system's broken because I don't know to fix it. I don't know how one goes about it apart from to start talking about early life trauma at a much earlier age and really locating mental health conditions in early life trauma, as Gabor Mate does. But yeah, it's an epidemic.
It is, sadly. So in the book, you also explore this concept of an acceptable mental illness. Will you speak of what you think is an acceptable, quote unquote, mental illness and condition that's sort of societally accepted within the rural elite?
Well, I would say, it goes back to narcissism. For quite a long time with this book, I wasn't talking about that because it's a kind of reveal. But I realized as I was walking here today that I sort of have to. And certainly narcissistic tendencies and clinical narcissism is something which is an accepted mental health condition within the rural elite, simply because they're fun. They're the life and soul of the party. They're helicoptering into a crisis. They fit with the sort of pattern of what is, dinner party fun within those sort of communities. So I would say that really, I mean, I don't really get into any other mental health condition. It really is those two that I explore in the book, bipolar and narcissism.
Because I would argue that to an extent, eating disorders are somewhat so acceptable.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
And I think from someone who suffers from an eating disorder, I can spot them a mile away. And I mean, I'm always amazed at how so many people are just in complete denial. Particularly, I look at marriages and I think, how do you not pick your wife up or your husband up on the fact that they've got a raging eating disorder
or alcoholism?
Yeah, and drug addiction.
Yeah. I mean, addiction. I'd say addiction. The big umbrella addiction term of all of those, gambling, alcohol, drugs, eating disorder. Those are all thoroughly acceptable, I think, within the rural elite, for all the obvious reasons. Maybe I need to lay it out, but looking thin, being a laugh at parties, taking the drugs, being hypocritical about it. Yeah, all of those things are let fly well under the radar of what anybody thinks is a worry. And I do explore that in the book. I'd sort of forgotten about that. It definitely comes up.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's a really important subject to broach because I've had an experience recently where I was really singled out for my eating disorder because it got to a point where, I wasn't in a great way. And because anorexia is a very visible mental health issue and people feel that they, for some bizarre reason, are very entitled to comment on the state of your health and say, right, well done when you put on weight or you're okay when you lose weight. When in fact, you're looking at all these people around you who are drinking themselves into oblivion, taking drugs, or who might be bulimic. And it's just always been an area of curiosity of mine, how one is so targeted sometimes when something's very visible, and the invisible illnesses we tend to focus on less.
Yeah, and do you think it's because it's just, socially, I mean, I was certainly brought up to be, thin, beautiful, all of those things that, and so that's, you could never be too thin. And I think certainly that sense of entitlement to start commenting on someone's body is absolutely rife and outrageous. And certainly, again, actually, Tessa in the book, she wishes she was as thin and dyed blonde hair as Roz. And, because she is visibly, according to the social mores, the way she looks is unacceptable. She doesn't look like Roz. in her sassy genes. But yeah, I mean, you know, it's appalling that somebody could feel they could make a comment on anyone, any physical appearance at all. It seems an absolutely extraordinary thing that's, I don't know quite as much of it persists now, because I've so taken myself out of any kind of social scene, I think, because I just couldn't bear it. That, you know, I don't know how much it persists now, but, you know, I'm sure it does.
Yeah, I can assure you it sadly does. But I think, again, I do think it's quite a class thing as well. I mean, I definitely notice it more within, say, these sort of slightly higher socioeconomic groups.
And generationally, would you say it's...
Yes, definitely. Yeah, more pervasive amongst the older generations.
The older generation. Yeah.
I mean, I pick my parents up on it, who are, I mean, or the first to comment on physical appearance. And it is awful sometimes, the jokes that get thrown around, and you're just listening and you just think, this is just not acceptable.
Right. And do they hear it when you pick them up, or do they tell you?
No, they get quite annoyed, actually.
Right.
The opposite.
So
and
do they think you're being like too
PC and just, oh, for God's sake, lighten up. You're so boring.
Right.
You know, I mean, the other day, and it's also, I get this real frustration with the over pathologization of mental health conditions. So labeling people as, oh, they've obviously got OCD, or they've obviously got ADHD, or they're a narcissist. It really frustrates me, because particularly when you really suffer yourself with a condition, it can be really undermining when suddenly every other person is being diagnosed with a condition that you spent a lifetime really trying to sort of work on.
Yeah, no, I understand that. And not that my gender fluid child is autistic, and which I don't consider a condition. It's only a disability, because when it has to meet the typical world. But it drives all of us completely mad when we hear people constantly saying they're a bit autistic. And I do pick people up on it all the time, because you can't be a bit autistic. You either are or you're not.
Yeah, I also do that.
It's infuriating.
It is. It's absolutely infuriating. But there's also a thing with OCD, and it's this perception that, oh, I'm really neat and tidy, therefore I have OCD. It's like, no, the two really don't correlate. So I just I have a bit of a line, and I do occasionally feel really frustrated, but sometimes you just have to let it go. Yeah. Because unfortunately, it's like with trauma, again, another very overused term at the moment.
Overused term, I know. And I'm hesitant to use it outside of an exact discussion around it. But do you think that it, at least because all of these conversations have reached such visibility, that it's better too much than too little? Or
I do. I think it's better we speak about it more than less, I have to say, because as you as you outline in the book, there is still a huge stigma attached to so much of it. And for someone to stand up and say, I am really struggling, I'm going through an episode at the moment, or I'm going through a wave, there is still a lot of shame that surrounds that. And I'd like to get to the point where one can feel that they're not judged and ashamed by admitting that they're in a bit of a bad space at the moment. And I think particularly with bipolar, people really shy away from it. Like, oh my God, you must be crazy. You're in a manic state. I don't want to be near you. And I think that's something that society needs to work on. Yeah,
I mean, I'd like to see when the expression of bipolar is seen as an expression of an early life trauma. And that compassion to be met with that kind of compassion, rather than a sort of a fear, like, exactly, we all need to get away from this person right now, because that absolutely is the expression. And I've seen my friend, in some terrible states, and there's a small group of us who've known them for a very long time, and we have a kind of, figurative flag system when we know that they're just on the rise. And there's a moment, and it happens every time I'll walk into their kitchen, and the look has come into their eye. They're not there anymore. Somebody else is standing there, and they're really frightening. And they frighten me, and I've known them for well over 30 years. So I really understand that revulsion, really, from it, and just wanting someone else to come along and just deal with that person. But I know now, I look at them and I just see the most screaming trauma coming out of them. And, really, until that's met, and that's what I wish that those suffering through very visible psychotic episodes, and also those suffering from invisible psychotic episodes, could be seen in that light and dealt with like that, which may still involve sectioning them. It may still involve using drugs to help them stabilize. It may involve all of those things, but what it won't involve is a kind of they're crazy and we're fine. And that's the bit that I find deeply upsetting, because that's simply not true and it's not the case. And to separate and make them and the other crazies, or the person on the street shouting at a lamppost, you know what I mean? It's like, to greet that person's distress with a shred of humanity and a link that this is another human being who once upon a time was just a little baby in their mother's arms. They weren't always like this. That's the change that I'd like to see.
I know, and it's the concept of you weren't born like this or
you
with
weren't
this.
Born like this.
It's a product of your environment.
Absolutely, and intergenerational trauma. I mean, I think Ruby Wax speaks really eloquently about it. I think she's a fascinating take on it, because she absolutely understands there are moments, even though she does everything that she possibly can do in terms of management, she still has moments when she has to say to everybody, it's coming, okay, we all need to lock down, and deal with it. So because the lever has broken in her head.
And what one hopes to do, and I think, again, through your book and through other tools and people just opening up these conversations and helping to dispel the shame that people feel who are going through about to enter into an episode, or who are in an episode of whatever mental health condition it is, if it's bipolar, if it's bulimia, if it's OCD, and they can actually say, look, guys, I'm really struggling at the moment. And if you've got a community around you that can actually offer some help and proper support and constructive help, rather than, I mean, what some of my friends used to say was, oh, I forgot, you just need to do this. Why can't you do that? You really need to just, stick to the regimen. You know what food you're meant to eat and you know what exercise you're meant. And as though it's literally just this formula that I'm supposed to be able to follow with sort of my eyes closed.
Right, which inevitably you're going to fail sometimes and then feel utterly shit about it.
Of course.
And unsolicited advice from people, especially from people who have no direct experience, that... it's no joy.
Well, it does the reverse, doesn't it? It sends you into more of a cloud of shame, and therefore next time you're less likely to then seek help, and potentially you sink further and further into the abyss of basically your depression or whatever it is, anxiety, or the coping strategy of the disorder's choice, I would say, rather than your choice.
And what have you found does help the most?
Like, I mean, like we've said, just feeling loved, feeling safe. And I think, again, it's a journey. And as I get more confident in myself and discover more about who Pandora is and who she needs around her, and just getting to that stage where you know that it will pass. You know that it's a wave. It's like, this analogy of your mood being like the weather. It may be really cloudy and stormy at the moment, but the sun will eventually come out, and it might take a day, it might take a week, it might take 2 months, but it will eventually pass. And just knowing that you can sit through it. And it feels horrendous at the time. But I think as you surround yourself by friends also who allow you to communicate and to say that you're struggling, I think that's a crucial thing, instead of being surrounded by more narcissistic types who see you as a problem and a problem that needs to be fixed. I
think that's one of the things that I've learned undoubtedly, is making a very clear choice about who I tell and who I talk to. And I remember my therapist at one point just saying to me, especially when the black box opened in my head and I understood what had happened to me, she just said, do not talk to anyone who you don't think is going to believe you, because you would just re-traumatize. Just don't. Just say nothing. It's fine. Not everybody needs, do you know what I mean? And I think, because up until that point, the desire to be understood is so enormous. And it's sort of, there's this kind of almost childlike feeling, isn't there? I think, anyway, for me, that somehow, if you can make yourself understood, it's all going to be. But the fact is that there's a million agendas out there which won't necessarily want to understand. And I think that's something which Tessa at the end of the book begins to understand. And certainly my friend struggles with understanding, is who to tell and who to talk to and who just to be like. My therapist calls it an air of pleasantness, which I love, which is fine, because otherwise you just make it worse, don't you? I mean, you re-traumatize.
Absolutely. And it's this concept of boundaries. And actually, I think for people who struggle with mental health conditions, boundaries are absolutely vital, and especially in the face of a clinically diagnosed narcissist, because if you don't have boundaries, you're just going to be literally sort of slapped around the face time and time
it's
again.
The toughest. Just recently, I had an experience with somebody, and for the very first time, and I'm 53, for the very first time, I pushed back and said, I don't deserve to be talked to like that. And I thought afterwards, and I thought, my God, it's taken me that long to be able to pull away from that instinctive sense of belonging and say no. It was, but that's the work that I've done over years and years and years, but certainly, in the last 4 or 5 years working with somatic experiencing. And God, I wish I could get the level of help and support that I've had to every single person. I've been so lucky, to find the people I found. And I'm very aware that, not everyone has access to that.
I think also that it's just a reminder that there is hope of one not always being triggered by a clinically diagnosed narcissist. I think what I've definitely discovered is, as I found more of myself, it's almost like there's less of a visceral reaction. I can see that it's unreasonable from a distance, and I can see that it's their stuff. And I can actually be in an environment and be in a space with them without being triggered by them. And that's been a very recent phenomenon, because before it would feel like, these comments that would come left, right and center, it would be like a stabbing wound to my heart. And now actually, so I don't deserve to be treated like that. I deserve more. And as that sort of tiny semblance of self-love, although I kind of don't like using that term, or self-acceptance is ignited, I can see that the boundaries actually start getting bigger. And it's been a long, long process, as we've spoken about, but it does happen. And I think that's, some people need to sever all ties and all contacts with a clinically diagnosed narcissist, particularly if it's a parent. And I understand that. But for me, that doesn't feel like true healing. And I feel that true healing means that you can be in a space with someone who might trigger you, but it doesn't actually, resonate and doesn't really land in the same way that it used to.
That's tremendously brave, I think, of you, because it's the disentangling, being able to disentangle from either a family member or a parent. I mean, that's pre-verbal entanglement there. That is just an incredibly slow, complicated piece of work to take on. So I salute you.
Well, it's an ongoing process, and I can't say that it's easy, nor do I never get triggered. But let's see, I'm still not at the stage where I'm like, that inner child is completely healed, so I'm like, okay, off I go, I'm independent and I've got my life. I'm still definitely reliant on going home and having that slight cocoon, even though it feels very unsafe cocoon, so it's a sort of slight oxymoron, but in a sense it is.
I mean, I know one person who, and they did look it up, it's a known thing, necessary family estrangement, where they cut. No, I know 2 people actually who did it, who came to the conclusion that there was no way they could disentangle. Not, as we all know, it's not up, you can't rely on them to do anything, it's all up to us to do the thing. And they realized they couldn't. But that's 2 out of many, many people who, who have experienced that and are trying to operate as a single unit and not get tangled up whenever they're with them. And I know, and I find it incredibly tough, but I do it just by limiting the amount of time.
Yeah, I think that's crucial, is knowing the amount of time you can spend in their space. And it is possible to love a narcissist.
Absolutely.
I mean, and that's the thing.
That's what's so crazy making and difficult about it, because the love is there. And they can be enormous fun, and they can be the person who makes you laugh more than anyone in the world, and all of those things can be true.
And they have these lucid moments, and that's something that I learned as a little girl, or should I say no, that's something that I've learned as an older woman, as opposed to a little girl who always thought that I was actually getting through and I was being heard, and behaviors would change and I was really like making headway, and then suddenly 2 hours later everything's literally back to square one and I haven't been heard. And actually now knowing, okay, Pandora, you're going off on a rant. This is not going to land or affect any kind of change whatsoever. But I know that that's the expectation. And I think when you really access that inner child, and and you nurture her yourself, and you realize that actually I don't need them to change, because that's their trauma. That's them dealing with something that they went through. And it's not my fault, and I'm not going to fix them, and nothing I do or no effect or any change that I make to myself is ever going to make them accept or love me in the way that I want to be loved. But they do have a language of love, and I think that's been part of my journey, is discovering what that language of love is, and it might be very different to mine, but it's there.
Yeah, and I think I really relate to that in terms of the disappointment that I've experienced again and again when I haven't managed my expectations, and I've hoped that somehow this would be different this time. And I'll go a little bit and be like, it's all so great now. And I'll just go that one step too far. And then it's like, oh no, here we are again. And so that bit of like, okay, the not expecting them to change, not needing them to do anything for my own transformation and healing, being very realistic about the amount of time and what's achievable, and all of those are the things that have made the big difference in my life. But that sense of disappointment, I do see it time and again with friends who are still, hoping maybe, to put this broadly, maybe this time mummy will love me, because that's basically the headline. When I've witnessed friends going again and again, jumping into the lion's den, when everyone can see that it's never going to happen, the thing that they want is never going to happen for a million different reasons, but not because they're unlovable and not because their mother doesn't love them. Those two things, it's not because of that, it's because of all the other things going on. So really that bit, I remember that moment hitting me like, okay, that's never going to change. However much I want that person to be different, it's not going to change. They are like that. And I can love them, crazy love them from this distance. I say to my children, it's all about proximity. Knowing what's the proximity that works really well, where you can really love that person, but not get stabbed in the face.
I know, and it's a real learning curve, and it takes time.
Is.
And it's really tough, and it's really challenging. And if you had said to me 15 years ago that I would be at this stage now, I would have thought, no way.
Yeah.
I need that maternal warm feeling, and I need to be connected to everyone in this really close way, because otherwise I'm not enough. And actually, like you said, it's all a question of proximity. It's all actually, some people you just need to keep at arm's length, and that's okay. Other people,
and they don't need to know.
No, yeah, and that's the other thing. Who you're vulnerable with is so crucial, because some people they'll really use it against you. And time and time again, I've learned that one, because you're overly vulnerable, and they use it as complete ammunition against you in the future.
Yeah.
You talk about, again, the book explores being sectioned. What do you think about sectioning in this day and age? We've obviously touched on it in this conversation a bit, but what do you want to convey in the book to people about sectioning? Do you think it is a necessary evil?
Well, that is a good question. It's a tricky one. If there could be an alternative that made that person safe and their people around them safe, their children safe, then that would be better, because section, it's pretty harsh. It's pretty brutal for everybody concerned. The people who cause the section to happen, the people, the social workers and the police and the ambulance and everybody who are there doing the section, and obviously for the person who's sectioned. The whole thing is utterly brutal, and they're taken into somewhere which is, overcrowded. And it's full of people in all sorts of different states of distress. They're not places where you are going to get better by, you're going to get leveled depending on the drugs that you're being put on, and you're going to be made safe, and that's in inverted commas. But in terms of getting better, that's not what's going to happen there. I'm not sure what the alternative is, what could be done, because I have been up close with psychosis a number of times. And, I've been in situations with, broken bottles and blood and people rampaging. And, when they're taken away, there's a kind of sigh of relief, because it's really dangerous. So I don't know. I don't know what the alternative is. I wish there was one. But for now, I think those services, they're providing a necessary service without there being an alternative. I think the thing that's really missing, which could be changed absolutely pronto, is just the amount of free psychotherapy that's offered to people who are walk-in psychosis into A&E. At the moment, it's, I think you get 6 sessions if you're lucky. Which is absolutely not enough. And I think walk-in psychosis and suicidal into A&E, not every single person who walks in there needs to be sectioned. There's a whole raft of other things that could be happening. which would make that person safe, which would ease the pressure on the system that is sectioning people. It's a lack of resources. I mean, I'm banging a drum that's being banged by plenty of people, but it is a lack of resources. And if I were Prime Minister of this country, I would be putting absolutely everything into the mental health system.
Eleanor, what do you hope that comes out of your book? So what message would you really like to leave with people if you could identify 3 main messages from the book?
Well, it's called In Judgment of Others for a reason. I would like for people to leave the book questioning and reevaluating their own judgments around the different kinds of mental health conditions that they come up against in life, the visible, and to explore the invisible. I really wanted people to explore their own judgments around that. I think that's the main one, actually. Really, there's, I think it's just judgments around how we treat people with bipolar psychosis, and how there's a sort of mood of denigration, and how we celebrate the narcissists. And I'd love people to walk away from this book exploring that. I've had a very good friend, again, who has first-hand experience of the experiences that Tess has had. And I sent her an early copy. And she really was a test case, because she absolutely she's lived this. And she rang me up and said, thank you so much. And that really, I was just like, oh God, because, if somebody who's lived it can say that I've just aimed it right, and it's all about empathy, and it's all about understanding, and it's not about judgment, then I really felt like I'd done a good job. So I was touched.
And finally, you've alluded in this conversation to rallying around people with bipolar. What do you think is the most useful thing as a carer or supporter of someone with bipolar? What can they do when that person is in an episode?
Absolutely, just let them talk. If you've got an hour and they're not at the section stage, but they're just at the manic stage. And I know with my friend, we always set up this system where when they're in a kind of okay stage, they'll say, look, next time you think I'm on the rise, everybody kind of raise the flag, and I promise I'll listen to you. And of course they never do, because the moment comes and they're having such a good time as they rocket up into their manic. But then there's a moment always when they start talking about things that are going on, which are absolutely not happening right now, but they absolutely did happen to them 30 years ago, but they put it on now. So they've got the time and place wrong, but they've got the event absolutely right. And I would say to anybody who is a carer and sibling or family member of someone, if you've got the time, just let them speak. Don't push back. Just let them get it out and out and out of their system, because they need to express the stuff that happened to them when they were little that they couldn't talk about then. And if you can just keep doing that and allow that little pressure cooker to come off, you might avert the psychosis. You might not, but it does mean that when they come around the circle, around the other side, you can then have a conversation with them about it. So I would say, do your best to listen and not judge and not push back and not deny their reality.
Eleanor, it's been such a fascinating conversation, and I really, your book is just so well written and it's so engaging.
Thank you.
And really good luck with it. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.